issues that we must understand in order to have an adequate conception of human development. And so she has made some very challenging and important contributions here. Of course, she has her contributions to the capability approach, the Women in Human Development, Frontiers of Justice, Creating Capabilities, are still required reading for anyone who wants to understand capabilities. But she has also drawn attention to the importance of other issues. For example, feminism, gender inequality, the oppression of women. She has worked in a literature on moral emotions and expanded it, pushing into political emotions, emphasizing the importance of political emotions for political theory and for political practice. She has championed recognition for people with disabilities, and also championed recognition of injustice on the global scale. Her work demands changing our relations with non-human animals, and it calls upon us on the human side to engage with thinkers and traditions of the past, starting with Aristotle, the Stoics, Grotius, Rousseau, Kant, and also with expressions, artistic expressions, especially in music. And finally, I would say that in doing this work and in her very being, she demonstrates the importance of liberal education and humanities for a functioning democracy. Well, I think I have much to learn. I'm really looking forward to this interview. And so I'll simply say thank you, Martha, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, for that very generous introduction. It's great to be here with all the HDCA people. I'm very excited. So, Laurie, you can lead.
Thank you. Yes. And I'm Laurie Keleher, and I'm a professor at New Mexico State University, but I'm also one of the coordinators for the North American Regional Network, who gets to sponsor this event today. And I'm very excited about that for many reasons, in part because I think that we're going to be discussing Martha Nussbaum's, one of her most recent books, Citadels of Pride. And I think this is a really great book for us as a North American network to be discussing, because it's centered in some of the issues that North America faces. Most of us in the North American Regional Network think that all nations are developing nations, and this book is very much a cultural book about the culture in the United States when it comes to sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. So Martha Nussbaum, my first question for you, Professor, is, do you agree with the statement that all nations are developing nations? And if so, could you please sort of walk us through how the United States in particular is a developing nation in the context of the narrative of sexual assaults and sexual abuse and sexual harassment? And because this is the HDCA, I'm hoping that you'll pay some attention to discussing this in the context of capabilities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, of course, all nations are developing nations. And I think the large philosophical issues that my book raises, which I think you're going to go on to ask about later, the vices that lead to objectification of women and abuse, sexual abuse of women, are pretty well universal. But how we approach the correction of what needs to change varies a lot from country to country. And I focus quite a lot on law because I do teach in a law school, but also because I wanted to emphasize that the way we correct things needs to be a process that has due process, respect for the accused, procedural justice, and also that, you know, brings everyone together in the context of thinking, what is the best direction that we can take to make things better for us all? And I think the social media shame culture does not do those things. And so I really want to emphasize the role of law. And in the US, the law has a peculiar structure here because sexual assault is treated under the criminal law. And it happens that in our country, the criminal law is different in every state. So it's a very messy business to make things better across the board. You have to do it one by one in every state, although there is a thing called the model penal code that has templates that states could use if they wanted to improve their laws. So that first, so about 1970, you could not get a conviction for rape unless the victim showed that she had resisted to the utmost and that the man had used force, more than the force that was necessary to actually have sex. So it was very hard, and it was counterproductive, because we all know that if somebody is holding a knife at you, you should not resist. You save your life. So, you know, it gave bad advice to victims. It made it almost impossible to get convictions, and it had to change. Now, the first change was the weakening of the requirement of resistance and the use of force. So long as there was a threat, then that was there could be a conviction. But the big moment came in 1980. Some of you may have seen the wonderful movie with Jodie Foster, The Accused, which is a very good portrayal of this landmark case, where a woman went to a bar to get some cigarettes, and then she started dancing, and she did some sexy dancing, where, of course, in the old days, that would be said to be a come on, and she deserved what she got, and so on. She got gang raped, but she was saying no all the time. And in 1980, a jury actually found the gang rapist guilty on the grounds that no means no. So that was established, and other courts quickly took that up. It wasn't enough, because sometimes the woman doesn't say no because it wouldn't do any good. She's isolated, the man is bigger than she is, or the man puts her in an extortionate situation. Let's say he's the principal of her high school and says, you won't graduate unless I have sex with you. So there are many situations in which she doesn't say no, but she's still raped. And so the new wave, and I was teaching with a man who was a theorist, Stephen Schulhofer, who contributed a lot to the new wave. So it was a group of cooperative women and men, wanted affirmative consent to be the standard. And that is not yet the case in all states. We're still moving there, but in quite a few states, that is the standard. And it's the typical standard on university campuses and in the workplace. Okay, so that's where we are. We still need to go a lot further. We need to have affirmative consent in all states. And we need a lot of other things that don't exist now, like prompt testing of forensic evidence. Rape kits are just sitting there until they decay and so forth. So I suggest a lot of improvements in the current process. But then let me move quickly to sexual harassment. There was still no way of dealing with this universal experience that women have in the workplace. They might not be raped, but they're treated in a demeaning and harassing way. One type of sexual harassment is what's called quid pro quo. You have to forfeit your job if you don't go along with the sexual demand. So that's a kind of extortionate demand that I talked about. But the other type, which is even more common, I think, is what's called hostile workplace environment sexual harassment, where it's just, whether through showing pornography to women or making constant remarks or bullying women in other ways, which needn't always be sexual, the atmosphere is made hostile to women. Now the question was, how are we going to make that into law? It was not a very propitious time to pass new laws in Congress. Never is in the United States. But what these women, one was an African-American attorney named Pauline Murray, and the other was the more famous theorist, Catherine McKinnon. They got a brilliant idea, which was that the 1964 Civil Rights Act already covered sex discrimination. And they went to Congress and they argued successfully that sex discrimination can include this kind of sexual harassment, that this is an offense of sex discrimination. And so they won that, and there were a series of cases that went before the Supreme Court and established the contours of that in law. So now we all know what sexual harassment is and that it's illegal, but it's very different from sexual assault because it's civil law, not criminal law. The plaintiff is the woman, not the state, and the defendant is the firm. And so the problem is that you have to not only show that the men did all these harassing things that the woman says they did, but you also have to show that the employer was neglectful, did not try to stop it. And of course, it's hard to show that. The employer might say, oh, I put up signs saying don't harass women. And they'll try to sneak out of it in lots of ways. So that's where we are, that we have the contours of a good law in place, And we have cases that exemplify that. But then we've won convictions against some very big employers, including General Electric, in one case that was decided by my local Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago. But, you know, it's still too hard for the woman to win. And it's not only women. I say throughout my book that men are often harassed sexually in the workplace too. It's an offense of power. It's not a heterosexual offense entirely. And in fact, one of the big cases was a man on an oil rig who was sexually harassed by the other men on the oil rig. So anyway, we still find that the plaintiff has too hard a time winning. And I talk about many suggestions for making that better.
Thank you. And I'm going to come back to questions about the law. That was a great example about how even in the United States, it's a developing nation, and that we're increasing those capabilities by allowing women to feel more comfortable in different spaces, and men too, as you point out. One of the things about the Me Too movement that I think did a lot of good was that people were aware, some of them for the first time, about how ubiquitous the sort of harassment you're talking about is. I don't know any woman who couldn't say Me Too, not a single one.
Right.
And that I think did a lot of good.
I think that just let me say one more thing. I think that you're absolutely right about that. But I also found, as particularly around the confirmation hearings of Justice Kavanaugh, this is why I wrote the book, that people were misinformed. They thought that the Me Too movement was just started now by a bunch of Hollywood celebrities. And they didn't know this patient work of many lawyers, many plaintiffs for 30, 40 years had been going on in the trenches. So I wanted to bring that work to people's attention and say, you know, all the work, a lot of it had been done already. We just needed to realize.
Yes, and the book does an excellent job of tracing that history. So I should have said a few more things about the book in general. It's a very rich book that talks about the history of this evolution of the law. And it gives several good case studies, including 3 that you focus on. And one of my favorite parts of the book is what I'd like to ask you about next, is this concept of pride. And so I'm very interested in the concept of pride that you give us, and how this particular species of pride leads to a sexual abuse in different forms. And I'm also curious about how you see this political moral emotion or attitude, if you don't see it as an emotion, relating to your other work on political emotions.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that I had written before about the objectification of women, treating a woman as a thing. And so I come back to that in this book. But then I say, well, what leads to that? What is it about people that makes them do that? And we have to go behind it and see what cluster of traits makes people do this. Now, by pride, I do not mean the way that pride is used in the gay pride movement. That is a kind of confident, happy self-assertion. By pride, I mean the vice that's named and criticized in Dante's Purgatory, where it's one of the cardinal vices, and it's the vice that consists in thinking that you're above other people and that they don't really count. And the proud in Purgatory are depicted by Dante as bent over like hoops, so they can only see their own bodies. They can't see other people. They don't look out, and they don't hear, they don't see, they just look at themselves. So that's what I mean by pride. Now, it's not exactly an emotion because it's a character trait. It pervades a long stretch of someone's life. But of course, it contains emotions as well. And I talk about the distinction between the occurrent emotion of pride and then the longer character trait of pride. And I think you can have a momentary emotion of pride without having the bad character trait. But the trait is also plural, because there are people who have race pride, but don't have class pride, who have class pride, but don't have race pride. Gender pride, though, in so many societies, is something that men are brought up to have. They're brought up to think just because they are male, women don't have to count for them. They don't have to really look at them. They don't have to really see them. They can treat them as interchangeable building blocks of their own happiness. And so that's what I'm talking about there. And I think that it makes an addition to my other work on political emotions. It's something that I really hadn't included, I guess partly because I was approaching it emotion by emotion rather than thinking in terms of the bad character traits and how they're inculcated. So I do feel I'm breaking new ground here.
Yeah, I thought that it was very helpful to understand this idea of only seeing yourself and this narcissistic tendency of not recognizing the others as valuable. I also agree with you that the law is a very good way to move forward on this, and that the law can be effective because it's universal and impersonal, not personal, so that a person might recognize other people because the law says, look, these people matter. And it has this educational role that you discuss so well in the book. And then there are other people who might not get out of that hooped situation in which they're only looking at their own interests, but say, wow, if I do this, there are going to be real consequences. But what I'm curious about, and what I'd like you to talk a little bit about now, is how those who seem to escape this sort of accountability, who don't recognize, who might be so concerned only with themselves that they don't actually see that the law applies to them too. So one example might be that then candidate Donald Trump in 2016 was recorded on, well, the recordings were released in 2016, but he was recorded earlier on Access Hollywood about saying, when you're famous, they let you do it. You can touch women, you can grope women, you can grab women, very famously said this. And it seems like he's an example of somebody powerful for whom there wasn't accountability in a real sense. And I think that in local situations are often popular people, powerful people within their own local sphere who don't seem to have this accountability that we're hoping will come through the regulations of sexual harassment in the office or other zones. Could you please speak to that a little bit about those cases that?
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, law works in several different ways. It, first of all, as you say, has an educational role to play. Children today grow up knowing that sexual harassment is illegal, and no matter whether their parents give them good instruction or not, that's out there and they should learn it. It also expresses society's most important values. We understand that society has decided to take a stand on this. And finally, it has deterrent value. Because there are sanctions attached, people hesitate before doing it. So in lots of workplaces, I think there are plenty of people who would really like to harass women, but they won't do it because they're deterred for fear of punishment. It would be better not to want to do it, but so if you want to do it and you're deterred, that's better than doing it. So that's, I think, basically where we are. And I do find that in the university, when I was in graduate school, there were no rules. And I'm talking about now about informal university rules and informal tribunals, which supplement the role of law. But there were no such things. Harvard was one of the first, after the time I was a graduate student, to put in a formal policy on sexual harassment. But there was none when I was a student. So all that I could do, and my fellow women, was to go to the chair of the department, and the chair of the department was clueless, had no way of knowing what he should do about it, because it was always a he. There were no tenured women at Harvard in those days. And so, it all became personalized, whereas law takes it out of that realm. It says this applies to all. It's not because X dislikes Y. And when the chair enforces it, it's not because the chair is being harsh to Y, and so forth. It's just the law. So that has made things a lot better. And I think today, sexual harassment is relatively rare, and the people who do it are basically people who could neither be educated nor be deterred. And in the university, there are few, there are some. And if we think about the philosophy profession, I think we know one or two, but these are people of sort of fixed pathology who probably could not be deterred. Now, what about in the rest of society? I do think that when workplaces have clear rules and we know what's going to happen to somebody who breaks the rules, that has made things a lot better in any kind of well-regulated workplace. But of course, there are workplaces that don't have a clear regulated structure. And so my Citadels of Pride, the title of the book, I pick out 3 areas in which they're particularly ill-regulated. And one of these is the federal judiciary, actually, because federal judges at the high level can almost never be fired. And they have very few rules policing their conduct, or at least there's been reform recently. But nothing was said about sexual harassment, and clerks were not allowed to complain or divulge anything that happened in the judges' chambers. So there were two high-ranking federal judges, much later discovered to have harassed years and years of their clerks. And, you know, no one, sort of, maybe people knew, and I think in one case it was so well known that my university and many others did not recommend clerks to that judge's chambers, but still they could not bring a formal complaint. Whistleblowing was just illegal by the rules for clerks. Now that's changed. Chief Justice Roberts has had a commission and we put in some new rules, but still there's too much power concentrated in the hands of these judges. Second area is theater and media. As a former professional actress, this is an area that I know very well. And of course, there's no structure because no one has a long-term contract. You float from gig to gig. You're always vulnerable. You're always waiting for who's going to be the next one to hire me. So a figure like Harvey Weinstein can have great power, even if he's not your employer. So first thing is the workplaces themselves have had no secure structure. The unions were weak and they didn't put in any rules. That's changing a little bit now. But the main thing is that people didn't stay in one place long enough. So a big figure who's powerful in the whole field could have great power over many people's lives. And I focus on the classical music area because that's what I know best, and talk about figures like James Levine, Charles Dutoit, where they just had such power in the whole field that it didn't matter whether you were employed by them at the moment or not. They had power over you as a prospective employer. So that could be fixed only by tough rules in the contract that's negotiated between orchestras and management, or whatever, actors and management. And it's getting a little bit better, but it's still not enough. Third area is the area of sports. Now, here, professional sports have moved forward in quite a remarkable way because they have workplace rules now. There is a negotiated contract in the National Football League, the National Basketball League. Actually, I thank for great help on that part of the book, Adam Silver, the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, who's in the forefront of working for better rules for sexual harassment and domestic violence, which is another big issue in sports. But baseball is actually in the lead, partly because baseball has rules all the way down. That is, the minor, people get their training in minor leagues where you're already under contract. Contract is a great protector of women's dignity because you can negotiate rules about sexual harassment in the player management contract. But college sports is what I focus on. Now, most people who are not familiar with the US situation will be surprised to know that in football and basketball, most of the early training of players is foisted upon universities that are supposed to allegedly give them an education, although they don't really do that. But they're also supposed to give them training before they go into the professional leagues. This relieves the professional leagues of this large expense of training players, but it creates an arms race where the universities, to get these lucrative television contracts and so on, lower the academic standards and lower the behavioral standards so that somebody who does rape a woman, but they want him to be able to play, because if you've even been indicted for a crime, you can't play, they'll cover it up. And I talk about one such story in great detail, but there are many, many other such stories. Here, I think the structure is so diseased, and I'm going to get back to Trump in a minute, okay? But the structure is so diseased that we can't fix it without really just getting rid of college sports. That's what basketball is doing, and it's able to do it because it has plenty of players being trained in Europe and trained in now a minor league system within basketball. For football, I think it probably means ultimately getting rid of football as a major sport, but I won't convince very many people of that, but I think it will. I think in 20 years, the professional sport of football will no longer exist in anything like its current form. Now, what about politicians? for the most part, accountability has come in big time. Anyone who followed the demise of Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, would see something really heartening, where we had women coming forward, telling their story, but we didn't just have public shaming of Andrew Cuomo by his political opponents. We had an inquiry with due process, a thoroughgoing investigation, all of the things that I want, not just impressionistic gossip on the social media. And Cuomo was removed from office. Well, he resigned because he would have been removed from office. And Cuomo was a very, very powerful figure. He was ridiculous in his own defense because he said, "Oh, I didn't know these things were problematic." This is a lawyer. He knew what the law had been since 1980 on sexual harassment. If he didn't, he was just putting his head in the sand, like these pride guys who just bend over and don't see the world. But anyway, I think he was just lying, and he thought he could get away with it. So Cuomo was brought low. Now, Trump, I think no argument should use Trump as a premise. He's so unique that he gets away with not just that crime, but he gets away with financial crimes so far. We'll see what happens in the future. And with trying to upset the democracy. Today, we just learned that he and his hench people knew very well that this claim about the election was false, and they peddled these lies knowingly. I'm sure we kind of thought so already, but now we know it for sure with evidence. So, why does Trump get away with things? That it's a longer inquiry having to do with the collapse of the Republican Party. And I don't think we have time to deal with that here. I'm still hoping that Liz Cheney, who was a student of mine at the University of Chicago Law School, and other Republicans who I disagree with very strongly, but who are honorable Republicans, will do something, form a third party, get together. But until they do that, I think the current bunch is so cowardly, so timorous that Trump will hold great sway.
Well, and I don't think it's just Trump, though. That was the question, is that some people in smaller spheres that don't have the name recognition of somebody like Donald Trump also seem to be getting away with these sorts of things, even with law, because they're charismatic or because they have power, that these things don't go reported, or when they are, within just smaller systems, everybody says, "Oh, but it's this guy, he's so great, we'll just let him keep going."
We do agree that with Andrew Cuomo, and I think we have many cases now when the person is really removed from office or loses popularity. We also have this Dr. Larry Nassar, who abused all the gymnasts. We had hearings recently. And of course, even the FBI tried to cover up what he was doing. And this is a terribly shameful episode that we have to get to the bottom of. Why did the FBI falsify the testimony that these female gymnasts gave years and years ago? But anyway, now that's out there. And Simone Biles, with great pain, told her personal story, and so did the others. But, finally, he's removed. So too, the administrators at that university who helped him cover up these offenses have been removed from office, and so on. So I think if there is such a person, the thing that now can happen is the women can all get together, come forward, and then something will happen.
Okay, I agree that much progress has been made, and I think you do a great job of detailing that in the book. And it relatively, as you said, things have gotten a lot better, but I think we still have a long way to go. And as you mentioned, this has been going on for so long. It didn't just start a few years ago. And I suppose I'm impatient for more progress because I think there's still so many of these cases. But thank you. So as long as we got a little bit on politics, when I first reached out to you for a conversation, an interview, a talk, something to do for the HDCA, it was just after the world was sort of shaken by the events of January 6th, the insurrection in the US Capitol building. And at that time, we were going to talk more about one of your most recent books, Monarchy of Fear. The insurrection on the Capitol, I think, is such an event for the United States and for the world. And it's such a US event that again, as a North American regional network, we're very interested to hear if you have anything to say on that event in the context of your work. Thank you.
Well, the first thing to say is there was another one last week and it came to nothing. It was just a big poof. They had all the security, the Capitol was fenced around, but then these people came there and there were only a few people and they didn't do anything. So I was very relieved by that. Look, I think it was a terrible, shameful episode. And what was even more shameful is that after the fact, a lot of leading Republicans who knew perfectly well how horrible an episode that was, and who even said so at the time, like Mitch McConnell, just have been silent and have been kind of covering it up, not claiming that it's a good, and not even supporting the idea of a full inquiry into it. So the inquiry that we're having now to get all the facts down is being conducted only by the Democrats, which is unfortunate because, of course, it makes it look like a partisan witch hunt and they will try to portray it as such. But two courageous Republicans said, well, we want to join this group. One is Liz Cheney, whom I've mentioned already, and the other is a local congressperson here in Illinois, Adam Kinzinger, who's been a leading critic of Trump. And so they're on the commission, and I think they will nail down all the facts, which is important. But, this kind of thing is indeed very worrisome. I wrote Monarchy of Fear right after the election of Trump, so it was really about the fears inspired by that campaign. But of course, now we see much worse things happening. The fact that the very the integrity of our electoral system can be jeopardized and falsified by people, and that their partisans actually believe it. I mean, why is it that people believe things that are flagrantly untrue, that they could easily find out to be untrue? And this is a more general phenomenon in American society. It's not just about elections that people believe a lot of crazy stuff, but it's about vaccines, it's about doctors, it's about science. It's something that our education system ought to be solving. But I'm afraid here the power of social media has become so great that it defines people's day. They spend their whole day on social media and they don't interact with the truth. And institutions of education can say, look, this is what science has discovered. And I'm sure every time you turn on your TV, you see a commercial by a group of doctors saying, you should trust us. We take care of you. We know the vaccines are safe, blah, blah, blah. But, people just don't believe it. And they want to take some other completely unproven and probably quite dangerous remedy instead of the vaccines. And this is a huge social and medical problem in the United States. In other countries, people are crying out for the vaccine, and Biden is about to ship a lot more doses of the vaccine abroad to other countries. But in the US, people just can't be gotten to take the vaccine. I think in Illinois, we're doing pretty well. We do have a vaccination rate up in the 70%, and our governor has been a major force for goodwill and trust and so forth. And the African-American community has leaders that have tried to convince members of that community who mistrust the medical profession to take the vaccine. But, in a lot of the country, people just despise science and they despise the very notion of truth. And that to me is really, really scary. I don't know what to do about it, but I think it's all about how people deal with their fears, their fear of death, their fear of getting very ill, and the rational, of course, it's rational to be afraid of COVID, but the rational way to deal with it is what, let's say, my university is doing. We can come into the building only if we prove that we've been vaccinated. We can teach only if we wear masks, unless we stand 6 feet away from all the students, which sometimes happens. But that's a rule that the university can make. And most workplaces are now making rules like that. I can go to the opera tomorrow, fully attend a full performance for the first time in 2 years, only if I show my vaccination card at the door, and I also am wearing a mask the whole time. But, in a lot of places, people just flout those rules. People assault airline personnel. I'm sure you've all heard about this. because they are told to put on their mask. And like even in my gym, which is requiring vaccination, but they want to, the city requires masks too. But a lot of people in the gym are not wearing masks, and I've complained to the management, and they say, we don't want to put our employees in the vulnerable situation of interacting with these very aggressive members. So even in a gym which has vaccination requirement, you have people who just think, these are another case of the proud. I know who they are in this gym, these big beefy guys. And I can tell you that 100% of women that I see in my gym are wearing masks, but of men about 50%. So it's very interesting. But anyway, so, why is it that people think, because they're afraid, their reaction, instead of doing what's prudent and rational, is to just turn the other way and say, oh, I don't care, it doesn't apply to me. It's just the irrationality of the fear of death, I think, but it's compounded by the distrust of facts and evidence that's such a dangerous part of American society these days.
That's really interesting that that the correlation between the people you've identified as not mask wearers at the gym are also the people that the staff is afraid of, that
Right.
They wouldn't see them as respecting the staff, respecting the rules, respecting these things, and that creates those vulnerabilities. So it is persistent in several pockets. I'm also delighted to hear you're going back to the opera. I thought your treatment of Don Giovanni was really good on Pride. And so,
oh, thanks. Well, I'm writing, and we'll get to this again, but I have under a contract to write a book on opera, opera and liberal political culture, due in 2024. So not yet, but therefore I can say this is part of my research, not just personal entertainment, although it's that too. I teach a course on opera regularly with Anthony Freud, who's the CEO and general director of Lyric Opera of Chicago. And we have a wonderful time teaching these operas, but Verdi's Macbeth is tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to that very much.
I've often said that you write faster than I can read. So I look forward to these lineup of books. And your next book is on animals and capabilities. And this is an exciting topic for us, especially because Frances Stewart, in one of the introductory panels for the HDCA this year, gave a nod to your work as one of the people, and she was calling for more of us to come out and talk more about non-human animals and capabilities. And so I'm, and your chapter in the book that I did with Stacey Costco talks about animals. And so I'm very interested in hearing more about your next book. And that'll be the last question. And then all of you who are patiently waiting to ask your questions will have a shot. So thank you very much.
Oh yeah, I gave a plenary a couple of years ago on some of the ideas in the book. So some of you may have heard that. And of course, in Frontiers of Justice, there was this concluding chapter that gestured in that direction. But now I have a full-scale, quite long book, which really talks about why the capabilities approach can solve problems of getting an adequate theoretical basis for a theory of justice for animals. The book is called Justice for Animals, in a way that other theories like utilitarian theory or Christine Korsgaard's Kantian theory cannot do, so I argue. So it has chapters on the inadequate theories, it has chapters on how you adapt the capabilities, right? Because it's complicated to say how you would do that. And then it has chapters on companion animals, wild animals. And then the paper that my daughter and I co-authored that we presented in London 2 years ago, what was it? Yes, 2 years ago, is one of the last chapters. It's about friendship between humans and animals. So it contains I'm very grateful, not just to the association in general, but to this group that I've worked with within the association, Jeremy Bendick-Kamer, Amy Lynch, Brina Holland, and my late daughter who died in December 2019, who all worked on these ideas and presented paper after paper that I've learned from tremendously. And so it's in a way a group effort. I refer to a lot of that work in the book. But anyway, I'm hoping, because it's being published by a commercial publisher and they're really excited about it. In fact, They're going to start taking advanced sales on October 18th, they tell me, even though the book doesn't come out until next August. So they're really going to put a lot behind it and energize the market, I hope. And so we hope that it will actually do some good and make people sit up and take notice of these issues and of the fact that there is a theoretical approach that does not say, oh, it's only for animals that are sort of like humans, because we've had that approach already. And it's not an approach that levels everything to amounts of pleasure and pain, but that considers animals' free movement, their social lives, and the whole form of life of an animal. So I hope they'll be interested in that, because I think this is where we need to go in order to get progress in international law, in domestic law, and just in ethics.
I think it sounds like you're going to be talking about one of the things I think Keleher approached us so well with, including agency in animals.
Yes, it really does. I mean, absolutely what you and Stacy did in your book was to highlight that aspect. And I think this is one of the terrible shortcomings of the utilitarian approach. It's all very well, and I think pain and suffering matter greatly. And so Bentham, through Peter Singer, these people are really quite heroic for insisting that animal pain matters. But the weakness is in not recognizing agency. Animals move. They want to choose where to go, who to socialize with, and so forth. They have complicated and rich social lives. And I think Aristotle already saw that. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on his work on the motion of animals, where he talked about all animals, human and non-human alike, move toward an object of desire because of, he says, either perception or imagination or intellect, and then some kind of desire that gets them going. So that template that Aristotle put up already recognized animals as agents. And of course, this book elaborates on that in the light of a lot of modern scientific research. We now know a great deal more than we've known in previous years about all kinds of different animals, from marine mammals to fish, but also birds, who now turn out to be immensely intelligent and capable of planning and socializing and so forth. So I talk about all of those things and try to ask what approach would do justice to the diversity and complexity of the animal world.
That's what my own MA was in animal rights, so I look forward to that.
Oh, great, great.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to open the floor for other people. And you mentioned, Rachel, I know I speak for all of us in the HDCA community. It was really wonderful to get to meet her in Georgetown in South Africa, and that she came and was such a great part of this community. And it was wonderful to read that this good book is dedicated to her. And so, so thank you so much for being here and discussing the book. And then Kyla Navarro is going to take questions for us.
Okay.
So I'll mute myself because I don't think anyone has questions for me. So thank you so much. I wish I had hours and hours to ask questions to you.
Yeah, I want to thank you for setting this interview up and doing it so well with these wonderful questions.
Thank you so much for being here. It's just wonderful for us to have you. Thank you.
Hello, I am Kyla Navarro, a former or current student of Dr. Keleher. And one question we got, since your book focuses a lot on North American law, can you suggest how in North America might best think about the current plight and prospects of women and girls in Afghanistan, or in the context of your past work for women and girls in India? And this question is from Ms. Chloe Schwinke.
Okay, yeah, oh, what a terrible situation. I actually had the great pleasure of teaching a bunch of amazing Afghan women in Kyrgyzstan. I went to the American University of Central Asia, which is a liberal arts institution in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And, it's like a liberal arts college affiliated with Bard College. So they get a Bard College degree and they have a typical style liberal arts education. And the Afghan women were amazing. I remembered them so well because they were really the standouts of the whole program. They had such courage, and they said, we want to go back and change our country. So their parents, they told us, their parents wanted them to change the country. They had sent them to AUCA to get a liberal education and then maybe go on and get a graduate degree in the US and then come back to Afghanistan and change the way things are done. Now, of course, that's not going to happen now. The minute this all happened, I got out the photograph of me with these Afghan women and I wrote to the professor there and I said, what's going on with these women? So I've been steeped in this correspondence with these particular women, and they've recorded their stories for a podcast that two colleagues of mine have, terrible stories about what life was like in Afghanistan, but they also have to figure out what their future is. So I've been trying to support them for various things that they're trying to be able to stay in Kyrgyzstan, or some of them have gotten away to Qatar. Anyway, they also want to go to the US ultimately for graduate school, so writing letters of recommendation. So I mean, that's the one-on-one part of it, which I think is terribly, terribly important, because there are so many wonderful people who just need someone to help them and reach out. So that's one thing anyone can do. Ask your university what they're doing. Scholars at Risk has lots of good programs. And there are, funds that are being set up to support the further study of these women. What's happening back there, I hold out no hope. The Taliban made gestures saying, oh, we're not going to be as hostile to women, but already you see that they're telling women to go home when a man could do the job. So they're not forbidding women to go on to higher education yet, but they have to be separated from men. And what that usually means, we know, is that the education will be second class and it will be just a poor version of what's given to the men. So I think, it's a terrible situation. I don't know what can happen in that country. It's been a tribal society all along. And all the time the US was there, the US was just kind of keeping people from fighting to the death with each other. But the effort to actually change the society did not get very far because it's such a profoundly corrupt tribal society. So I think in the end, it's probably the right thing for the US to withdraw, although I think it was done in a rather chaotic way, which did not help the people who were there. But right now, I think we owe it to the people there to stand up for their rights and do something to help the ones who want to leave get out. But some will not be able to get out. India, of course, is a totally different situation. I think India has a dictator at the helm, and yet it's still a constitutional democracy. And still, when things are too far from Modi's pet issues for him to pay much attention to them, there is the rule of law. So at least women, and I don't think he particularly is hostile to women. That's just not his issue. He's hostile to Muslims and secondarily to Christians, and that's what he cares about. So it's a totally different scenario. But in a way, it's almost sadder because India has a noble democracy, one of the greatest legal minds of the 20th century, if not the greatest, the Dalit B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Constitution. We had Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar. I love that history. And that's the India that I love. And my friends in India are now all, they've retired because they have compulsory retirement at 65. So they're sitting around not able to do anything. And the universities are so oppressed that they can't do anything. But still, I mean, it's just totally the world different from the things are in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that. And I have another question from Oscar Garza Vasquez through Huvo. And he asks, in some places, this is also relating to less developed countries, law is not as strong and reliable. And what are some of your recommendations for those societies where accountability is almost non-existent?
Well, it's I think very difficult because you do have, it's even true in India that the criminal law is not as reliable. When I came there and I talked to feminist groups, I guess my assumption was that as in the US, the law was a path forward for women. But because of widespread corruption, because of the fact that a woman who lays a rape charge might take 9 years for her case to get into court, and by that time the evidence will have been stolen and the judge will have been bribed, and so women don't hold out much hope for law. So let me talk about that case first, and then try to move to cases that are still more anomic than that. So in India, what women find hope from is women's organizations. First of all, there's an informal local kind of justice, the panchayat system that Gandhi did a lot to revive. So they're village tribunals, which are elected, and those are actually very helpful for women. And they have now been required by the Constitution itself to include 1/3 representation of women on the panchayats. And they do great things for women. I brought a prominent US judge, Diane Wood, one of our most prominent female judges, to India, and we met with the panchayats from several different areas of Kolkata. And she was going to tell them about how women claim their legal rights, but they told her, I mean, they were so active and so articulate that she was bowled over. And she thought, well, if Americans only knew enough about their legal rights as much as these women, then we'd be a lot better off. So that's one thing that one can do, is have an informal kind of tribunal style kind of justice. And that's very common in Africa as well. Another thing is just organizations that stand up for women. You know my story about Vasanti that I tell in both Creating Capabilities and Women in Human Development, that true story of this woman who found membership in this women's organization, the Self-Employed Women's Organization, a tremendous source, both of credit, education, hope, sociability, political organization, and so on. So that's a great hope all over the world. So then I think in each country, you just have to look at the structure and ask, where can we dig in, and where can women actually do a lot? But I do think in default of the formal legal system, there's an awful lot that women can do for other women.
Thank you so much. I think that might be just about all the time we have for today. We might have time for just one more question or any closing remarks that Professor Nussbaum would like to make. The chat has been very active, with a lot of people wanting to hear from you on a lot of things, and even calls for your candidacy to president of the United States of America, to be clear. And I didn't think there was anything left you hadn't done, but I hadn't thought of that option, mostly because Socrates warns us in Plato's Apology that anyone who wants to really make changes in justice must lead a private, not a public life. But I'll leave the very last words to you, with the exception of this last expression of gratitude, both to Professor Nussbaum for joining us in this discussion, for Kyla and Heather and Mackenzie and Jay Drydak, all of whom helped, and of course Kathy, all of whom have helped put this on, and all of you who are joining us from all around the world, both today live and in the future recording sessions. Thank you. Thank you for making this possible, for this kind of dialogue to take place. I do think that these are the steps that lead towards more just world in so many ways. So I'll leave the very last word to Professor Nussbaum. Thank you once again, Professor Nussbaum.
Well, I want to thank you all too, and this wonderful association. Yeah, this association, one of its functions is to bring political people together with academics. And I'm sure out there are many of you who actually will run for office and become politicians in various countries. It's not for me. I even at one time thought of being a dean, and even that, because I have a very thin skin and I really hate it if I think I've made somebody unhappy. And you can't have a thin skin if you're going to be in politics or even educational administration. So I'm just better off doing what I'm doing, but I do hope that many people will get into the political fray, because we need gifted women now more than ever before. And if you look at American politics, you see how many, particularly women of color, are suddenly coming up and doing amazing things in politics. So I just hope you will all do that with the great abilities that this association has fostered. So congratulations to all of you for having concern for human capabilities. And I'll see you next year. Now, next year, I am giving a plenary address, but unfortunately, it happens during the first week of our classes. So I'm not able to actually go in person. They have a bimodal system, so I'll be doing it by Zoom again. But sooner or later, I'll see you in person. Bye.
Well, you said you'd like to make people happy. You've made us all very happy today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and everyone, and Jay and Kyla. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That'll conclude our session. Thank you. We're going to end on time.